You've had a cold, you've wind. Maybe you microwaved soup and pretended it was medicine. But centuries ago, humanity tackled the sniffles with leeches, mercury, dried lizard powder, and a level of desperation that makes WebMD look like a spa day. That's right, welcome to the phlegmy underbelly of history, where the common cold wasn't so common, and the cures were anything but. From sneezing into incense smoke to snorting roasted mouse guts, this is the history you won't find in textbooks. Mostly because everyone involved died of whatever they were trying to cure. Cozy up, it's about to get absurd. Still sniffling? Stick around. Like, comment, and subscribe, or the next time you get a cold, a medieval barber might show up with a rusty saw and 0 qualifications. Let's rewind, way back, before medicine had names that sounded like rejected Marvel. Villains before pharmacies were glowing corporate temples with aisles of daytime verses, nighttime placebos. Humans had ... ideas, not good ones, but ideas nonetheless. And if you think spraying saline up your nose is humiliating, just wait. It's 2200 BCE. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Also, incidentally, the cradle of wildly inaccurate diagnoses. Back then, a sneeze wasn't a symptom, it was a sign, a message from the gods. And your runny nose, that wasn't mucus, that was your soul, trying to leak out the front door. Let that sink in, you, lying in a straw bed, while a priest waves incense in your face and declares your body a battleground between divine wind spirits and your own. Phlegm. Because when your worldview is built entirely around angry deities and seasonal crops, a stuffy nose isn't a mild inconvenience, it's a cosmic disturbance. Cold, no such thing. You've angered Enlil, the wind god, or possibly Ninazu, the god of healing, who, let's be honest, wasn't doing a stellar job. So what did they do about it? Modern problems require Mesopotamian solutions. Enter the IAP, the priest-doctor-sorcerer hybrid who could heal your illness and curse your ex. Picture him, bald head, thick beard, dressed like a middle management warlock. He walks into your house, inspects your symptoms, nasal drip, watery eyes, a cough, and confidently proclaims, "You've been cursed by a ghost, probably your cousin, the one who drowned." His cure, not tissues, not tea, but a thick, viscous paste of crushed onions, lizard scales, and goat bile, smeared gently on your chest while he chants, in Sumerian, something roughly equivalent to, "Out foul spirit, and take your slime with you." The goat, presumably, had no say in this. There's something strangely comforting about this logic. Though you're not just sick, you're important. The gods noticed you. You're not weak, you're being tested. Today, a cold just means your co-worker sneezed into the communal airspace. In Mesopotamia, it meant you were the protagonist of a celestial drama, and someone needed to be sacrificed. Now, this wasn't all goat goo and ghost theory. There was a kind of system. The Babylonians kept clay tablets, literal stone prescriptions, and bless their dusty little hearts, they tried. They documented symptoms, treatments, side effects, and offered helpful advice, like avoid walking under cursed fig trees and chant this spell while inhaling sulfur smoke. Yes, the old suffocate the sickness with volcanic gas approach. Some remedies, to their credit, almost sound reasonable. Honey was used for its antibacterial properties. Herbs like thyme and myrrh made appearances. But then things always spiraled. Charred raven bones, menstrual blood, crocodile fat, It's like a medieval smoothie recipe curated by Satan himself. And don't forget the amulets. Cold were a clay medallion shaped like a demon's head. Because nothing cures congestion like terrifying jewelry. Let's zoom in. A young boy sits curled under a reed mat. Feverish. His nose runs like a broken faucet. His mother crushes garlic and onions in a stone bowl while whispering to the household. Gods, a priest arrives, swinging a censer of smoldering herbs, muttering an incantation. He doesn't ask about symptoms. He declares them. The boy has been touched by the breath of Namtar. Bring me the bile of a desert goat and the feather of a raven. Meanwhile, the boy just wants to sneeze in peace. But instead, he's about to get an aromatic goat bile chest rub and possibly a light exorcism dart. Now, it's easy to laugh, and believe me, we are. But there's a tragic beauty here, too. These people lived in a world full of mystery and death and chaos. Illness wasn't routine, it was terrifying. You didn't take the day off. You prayed your child didn't die from what started as a sore throat. So you turned to magic, because magic was hope. Even if it stank like fermented onions, and in some twisted way, the logic tracks. If a cold just appears, if it drips from your face like divine punishment, then surely someone must have caused it. You, your neighbor, your family goat who's been giving you side-eye all week. That's why these early treatments weren't just physical, they were spiritual, emotional, paranoid rituals of desperation. Because what else could you do? There were no bacteria, no viruses, no Tylenol, no humidifier with a lavender essential oil diffuser shaped like a mushroom. There was just belief. Belief that the world made sense if you performed the right chant, sacrificed the right animal, or wore the right terrifying demon necklace. And weirdly, maybe that belief did help. Not because the goat bile worked, but because someone showed up. Someone looked you in the eyes and said, "You're not alone. The gods are watching. We'll fight this invisible thing together." So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. Because before science gave us answers, superstition gave us comfort. However pungent and wildly inaccurate that comfort might have been. And so, the foundation was laid. For thousands of years to come, humanity would continue to treat colds with a perfect storm of confidence, nonsense, and mild hysteria. Goat bile optional. Let's move down the Nile. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, scarab jewelry, and absolutely unhinged ideas about your sinuses. The ancient Egyptians were masters of embalming, afterlife theory, and eyebrow game. But when it came to something as everyday as the common cold, they flailed like a cat in a river. You'd think a civilization that could preserve a corpse for 3,000 years could handle postnasal drip. And yet, their primary approach involved honey, incantations, and the occasional enema administered with a goose feather. Because, obviously, let's start with the Ebers. Papyrus, one of the oldest and most hilariously disturbing medical texts ever discovered. Written around 1550 BCE, it's basically the WebMD of ancient Egypt. If WebMD recommended crocodile dung and burnt hedgehog ash, the scroll is over 100 feet long, contains more than 700 magical formulas and remedies, and reads like the fever dream of a witch doctor with a PhD in chaos. Got a cough? Apply a paste of sycamore juice, honey, incense, and human hair. Nothing says feel better soon like gluing chest hair to your sternum with tree sap. Let's zoom into a particularly vivid scene. A middle-aged Egyptian man, a scribe, is coughing. He's sweating under the linen sheets of his home, near the temple of Karnak. His family is worried, so they send for a healer, not a doctor, mind you, but more of a pharmaceutical priest. He arrives with a palm leaf basket filled with vials of ground minerals, chunks of resin, animal parts, and scrolls. Lots of scrolls. He flips to a passage to expel the demons of the nose. Crush goose, fat with honey. Administer nasally. The man blinks. Wait, you mean shove goose grease up my nostrils? The healer doesn't blink. Twice daily, and you thought neti pots were invasive. Egyptians believed illness was caused by WHDW, internal rot, spiritual uncleanliness, or invading spirits, depending on which priest you asked and how recently he'd inhaled frankincense. Colds were considered minor spiritual disturbances, not enough to kill you, but certainly enough to compromise your ability to work, worship, or properly enjoy a cucumber salad by the Nile. Their treatments, a mix of practical herbalism, desperate, wishful thinking, and straight-up culinary experimentation. Honey was big. To be fair, honey is antibacterial, and they used it liberally as a base, a solvent, and an all-purpose sinus lubricant. But then things got weird, like mixing honey with pulverized donkey's hooves and inserting it, and we're quoting the text here, into both nostrils while reciting the chant of Isis. Imagine that. You're laying on your back, choking on equine mucus paste, while a man in a kilt chants to a bird-headed goddess and tells you to stay still. Medicine. Another treatment involved myrrh and frankincense, which, if nothing else, made you smell like a nativity scene. They'd burn these resins and have the sick inhale the smoke, which probably didn't do much for congestion, but did provide a warm, tingly feeling, possibly because you were lightly asphyxiating. And then there were the enemas. Oh yes, Egyptians loved enemas, the way modern influencers love matcha. They believed that the colon was the root of all evil, which is a bold stance to take in the desert heat. And if you were sick, your body must be clogged. So they used goose feather tubes, river water, and herbal blends to flush the system. If your nose was running, clearly the problem was your butt. Let that logic marinate. But what makes it even better or worse, depending on how squeamish you are, is that they assigned gods to these rituals. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, was invoked during cold treatments, because nothing says wisdom like sticking a bird quill where the sun don't shine. Despite the madness, there was structure. Egyptian medicine wasn't just trial and error guesswork. It was systematized, documented, and ritualized. Doctors, called SNOA, trained in medical houses called Per-Ankh or House of Life. They followed formulaic procedures, complete with diagnostic observations and progressive treatments. Step 1. Identify symptoms: cough, congestion, fever. Step 2. Assign a diagnosis: spiritual imbalance, demonic breath, clogged vessels. Step 3. Treatment: herbal ointment, chant, or aromatic fumigation. Step 4. Reassess. And if things worsened, blame the patient's sin. Truly timeless, let's not forget Imhotep, the high priest of Ra, and arguably the original multi-hyphenate architect, astronomer, healer, demigod, and almost definitely the guy who started the trend of mixing lentils with resin and calling it medicine. Thousands of years later, he'd be deified and worshipped as the god of healing, a title well earned by someone who once prescribed cow's milk boiled with dates and donkey saliva as a cold cure. There's a strange intimacy to these cures. Imagine your mother preparing a poultice, muttering prayers under her breath while rubbing crushed garlic on your feet, swaddling you in linen, and placing a painted amulet on your forehead. As absurd as it sounds now, it was care. It was love, masked in mysticism and goat milk. And they didn't just leave you to suffer. Egyptians believed in the power of comfort. The sick were kept warm, massaged with oils, and fed spiced wine, all while their fevered ramblings were carefully written down and analyzed for divine insights. Somewhere between delusion and diagnosis, you became sacred. But let's be honest, some of these treatments sound more like curses than cures. There's a documented formula involving cooked lizard, dried ground, and mixed with milk to be drunk at sunrise while facing east. Why sunrise? Why east? Who knows? Maybe the lizard spirits only work overtime before brunch. Even better. Another text advises boiling roasted mouse into a paste and using it as a nasal insert, which means someone, somewhere, voluntarily put mousy sludge up their nose and told others to try it. And yet, somehow, through all the oils, incantations, burnt rodents, and spiritual suppositories, some people got better. Because, as modern science would later confirm, colds are you'll recover in a few days, unless you're killed by the cure first, which in ancient Egypt was a very real risk. But don't judge them too harshly. They were working with what they had: the stars, the Nile, some herbs, and a lot of imagination. And considering that they managed to build pyramids with the same tools they used to treat head colds, we're going to cut them some slack. There's something poetic in it, isn't there? These were people who wrapped their dead like precious artifacts, but also shoved mint leaves up their nose and called it cutting-edge medicine, who believed a sneeze might be divine warning or just bad luck from a passing crocodile god. And that blend of science, superstition, and syrupy honey goo, it never really left us. Modern medicine may have swapped out lizard paste for ibuprofen, but the impulse is the same. Find something, anything, to make this misery stop. Wrap yourself in rituals. Sip something warm. Light a candle. Recite a prayer, even if it's just to the deity of over-the-counter. Meds, so tonight, if you're tucked under a blanket, sipping tea, and Googling, "Why does my nose only run?" on one side, just know, you're part of a long, proud tradition. And if you hear whispering in ancient Egyptian, ... maybe check your incense. Let's now turn our plague-ridden noses to ancient Greece, where philosophy blossomed, democracy was born, and medical science was a spirited mix of educated guesses and body fluid fan fiction. Enter Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, revered, respected, probably pretty smug. He lived around the 5th century BCE and revolutionized the way people thought about illness. Gone were the days of blaming every sneeze on demons or vengeful bird gods. Hippocrates had a better idea. Maybe, just maybe, people got sick because their goo was out of balance. Yes, goo, he didn't call it that, of course. He called it the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Together, these bodily fluids made up your health, your temperament, and apparently your entire personality. If they were balanced, you were healthy. If not, well, better. Start vomiting. Let's pause and reflect on the grandeur of that idea. 1 minute, you're the pinnacle of rational Greek thought. The next, you're blaming a runny nose on your excess cold and wet phlegm, as opposed to someone sneezing directly into your mouth during a symposium. To Hippocrates, the common cold wasn't caused by germs, because germ theory was roughly 2,000 years away, but by an internal misalignment of these elements. A cold that meant you had too much phlegm, obviously. So the treatment: bring the humors back into harmony, usually by purging, bleeding, or dosing yourself with something violently disgusting. Imagine going to your local clinic and being told, "Ah, yes, classic melancholic congestion. We'll just bleed you from the ankle and apply a mustard poultice to your spine. You'll be right as Athenian rain." The Greeks didn't have medicine in the modern sense. What they had were theories, and Hippocrates had plenty. He believed nature was the greatest healer, that food should be medicine, and that the body could fix itself if you just bullied it hard enough with diet, herbs, and enough induced vomiting. To make a frat house proud. Let's look at a case study. Picture an older man in Athens, a potter. He's got a sore throat, fatigue, sinus pressure, a typical cold. But to the physician, this isn't an infection. It's a temperament issue. He's diagnosed as being phlegmatic, cold, and moist, which means he probably also has a lazy personality. Charming, the cure. A regimen of hot baths, boiled leeks, vomiting, and possibly having a small hole cut in his arm to release the excess. All this because he sneezed 4 times before breakfast. But it wasn't just Hippocrates with a flair for the bodily. Dramatic, his successors, like Galen, who would later become the rock star of Roman medicine, doubled down. They systematized humorism into a full-on wellness doctrine. You want to know your personality? Check your dominant humor. Are you quick to anger? You've got too much yellow bile. You're choleric, quiet, and moody. You're full of black bile, melancholic, jolly, and irresponsible. Blood, just, lots of blood. And if you cry at sad music and sleep too much, congratulations, you're probably 80% mucus. Which leads us to phlegm, the star of our show. Phlegm was the least sexy of the humors, the one nobody wanted to claim. It was linked to sluggishness, cowardice, forgetfulness, and naturally, getting colds. A buildup of phlegm meant your body was trying to cool itself too much. So if you caught a cold, it wasn't because you stood in the rain. It was because your whole soul was soggy. How do you treat that? With heat, fire, spices, anything pungent enough to make you sweat and sneeze and purge the demons of moisture. Mustard baths, garlic poultices, wine boiled with pepper and goat droppings. Nothing was off the table, especially goats. But here's the kicker. People believed this stuff. Not just peasants, aristocrats, intellectuals, generals. Because, when your best science involves eyeballing someone's snot and declaring them emotionally defective, all you need is confidence. And to be fair, some of it kind of worked. Hot liquids can soothe the sore throat. Steam opens up nasal passages. Rest and warmth, generally good ideas. The issue wasn't what they did, it was why they thought it worked. The logic was always soaked in fluid metaphors. A cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a personal failure of elemental harmony. Let's take another peek into an ancient household. A young woman is bedridden, her nose drips, her head aches, her family consults. A traveling physician who shows up with a portable brazier and a leather pouch of herbs. He inspects her eyes, her tongue, and then solemnly declares her phlegm has become rebellious. He orders hot wine mixed with cumin and rosemary, a bath with olive oil and crushed onion, and a light bleeding from the foot. The family thanks him, pays in chickens, and he departs, leaving them with a very soggy teenager and the smell of spiced poultry soup. Of course, she gets better, because colds usually run their course. But the physician takes full credit. See, he says, the humors have been pacified, and everyone nods. because no one wants to argue with the guy holding the leeches. There was a kind of twisted optimism in the four humors. If illness came from imbalance, then healing was always within reach. You weren't cursed. You just needed to poop out more yellow stuff. And if you weren't better yet, you just hadn't bled enough. It was a very empowering, deeply horrifying system. Now, let's not pretend Hippocrates was all bile and bad breath. He did a few noble things. He emphasized observation. He encouraged notes and records. He believed illness wasn't divine punishment, which, at the time, was revolutionary. He even swore oaths about ethics that we still reference today, although we've trimmed the part about not cutting kidney stones yourself unless you're very, very sure. But when it came to respiratory illness, he was still working in the dark, and his followers, centuries later, would institutionalize that darkness into medical dogma. By the medieval era, the four humors had become gospel. Doctors prescribed based not on evidence, but on the color of your phlegm and your star sign. Imagine catching a cold and being told it was because Venus was in retrograde and your bile was too sassy. And remember, this wasn't fringe thinking. Humorism was medicine. It survived for over 1,500 years. It crossed continents. It became the framework of health, all because a bunch of toga-wearing men with too much free time decided that human beings were basically soup. But isn't that ... kind of beautiful? People wanted to make sense of suffering. They wanted to feel like they had control, that with the right herbs, right diet, and right amount of bodily leakage, they could ward off death. And in that, humorism offered hope. Misguided, gross, slightly deranged hope, but hope nonetheless. So next time you're nursing a cold, sipping tea, blowing your nose for the 4th time in 2 minutes, spare a thought for Hippocrates. He meant well, he really did. He just didn't have microscopes, or Advil, or any idea that viruses exist. All he had were fluids. So many fluids. And in his own weird way, he laid the foundation for what would someday become actual medicine, once we, stopped treating personality disorders with vomit and no-seds. So here's to blood, bile, and boogers. May they forever be balanced. The Roman Empire. Builders of aqueducts, conquerors of continents, inventors of toilets, with surprisingly good drainage. Rome gave the world roads, plumbing, and Julius Caesar's haircut. But when it came to curing a cold, their approach was a lavish blend of excess, ignorance, and have you tried sniffing owl brains? Yes, really. Let's set the scene. It's 67 CE. You're in Rome, capital of the ancient world, where senators are scheming, gladiators are bleeding, and wealthy citizens are lounging in togas, debating which wine pairs best with dolphin meat. You, however, are hunched over a brazier, wrapped in wool, sniffling into a piece of linen because your nose has become a faucet. What do? Easy. You go to the thermi public baths, the size of shopping malls. Because in Rome, healing started with steam. Not because it helped congestion, though it occasionally did, but because it was fashionable. Hot air, cold plunge, scraping. Oil off your skin with a curved blade. Health. Romans believed in balnea, at sailors' baths, and health. If your humors were misaligned, thanks again, Hippocrates. The best way to fix them was to sweat like a pig in August, and then dunk yourself in freezing water until you couldn't remember your own name. Imagine standing in a room filled with half-naked senators, gladiators, and the occasional philosopher, all silently pretending not to notice the snot dripping down your lip. Therapeutic, right? But the Romans didn't stop at steam. Enter Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist, an author of Naturalis Historia, which was basically the Wikipedia of the ancient world if every article was written by a wind-drunk uncle with a lot of opinions and a deep distrust of science. Pliny believed cold symptoms were caused by basically everything. Cold wind, hot wind, eating too many beans, sleeping with your mouth open, angering Jupiter, breathing improperly while standing near a statue. He had a cure for every possible trigger, and all of them were ridiculous. Let's unpack a few actual Pliny-approved remedies for colds and coughs. Roast owl brains. Mash them into honey. Apply to the chest. Drink boiled cabbage. Water while standing on one foot and chanting your mother's name. Insert roasted hedgehog fat into the nostrils. Rub warm badger grease on your soles, lest your lungs betray you. This is the man Romans. Called a scholar, to be fair, Pliny was an encyclopedia of absurd knowledge. He wasn't trying to scam people, he was just extremely confident in things no one had ever tested. He sincerely believed that sniffing the armpit of a young goat could improve respiratory health. It did not. But again, no germ theory, no virology, just vibes and dead animals. Let's follow a fictional Roman citizen, Marcus, a stonemason, waking up with a nasty sore throat. He trudges to his local apothecary, who is also a fishmonger, because licensing wasn't a thing. The apothecary offers him a syrup made from dried figs, vinegar, and powdered bronze shavings. That'll be 2 denarii, the man says. With the confidence of someone who thinks bleeding people is a universal solution, Marcus drinks it. He vomits. The apothecary nods, satisfied. The humours have spoken. But not all Roman remedies were culinary war crimes. Some were almost reasonable. Romans used thyme and eucalyptus to treat congestion herbs we still use today. They brewed teas from mint and chamomile, took honey with lemon again, shockingly modern, and even used mustard plasters to open airways. But these were drowned out by recommendations like crush mouse droppings with wine and drink at moonrise. You win some, you lose some. Now, Roman society was intensely hierarchical, and that extended to healthcare. If you were rich, you got private physicians, usually imported from Greece, where medicine was considered an art form and a profitable scam. If you were poor, you got prayers, garlic, and possibly a shove toward the nearest fountain. The elite had access to ingredients. The poor could only dream of saffron, cinnamon, imported resins. And yes, pearls. Crushed pearls were sometimes added to remedies for the upper class, partly for their alleged healing properties, and mostly so your medicine could taste like I'm richer than you. And then there were the gladiators. Ah, gladiators, Rome's protein shake-loving, sword-wielding influencers. When they weren't being stabbed for entertainment, they were considered a source of potent biological energy. So naturally, Roman women, especially wealthy ones, believed that gladiator sweat had healing powers, specifically for skin ailments, colds, and nervous disorders. Imagine selling your used gym towel for medicinal purposes. That was a gladiator's side hustle. Vials of sweat scraped from their skin were sold at bathhouses and markets, used as face cream or stirred into wine. Did it work? No. Was it a biohazard? Absolutely. But again, there's something soothing about feeling close to power, even if it's via second-hand perspiration. Romans also used cauterization, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. If your congestion was severe, A physician might recommend applying hot metal near the sinuses or temples to draw out the humors, they said. To ruin your week, more accurately, another gem. Sneezing powder, a blend of herbs and pepper snorted to violently trigger a sneeze and, allegedly, clear the soul. You ever sneeze so hard? You saw the afterlife. Romans aimed for that on purpose. Despite all this, Rome was paradoxically advanced. They had sewage systems, public health mandates, and medical texts that at least attempted to catalogue symptoms. Galen, the Roman physician mentioned earlier, was arguably the most influential medical writer for 1,000 years. He documented surgeries, developed theories on the nervous system, and still thought cold remedies included. Drinking warm pig urine. Progress is a process. It's worth noting how ritualized health was. Romans made offerings to Asclepius, the god of healing, and to household gods who guarded the sick. They hung charms over beds, wore herbs around their necks, and avoided certain foods during illness, not for nutrition, but to appease celestial powers. Medicine wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, social, and theatrical. And yet, through all of it, the pearl milk, the roasted bird heads, the goat sweat smoothies, people survived, mostly, sometimes, or they died spectacularly, but not before sneezing in the direction of history. There's a certain tragic comedy in it all. The Roman Empire, with its vast infrastructure and intellectual legacy, couldn't figure out that cold symptoms were caused by tiny, invisible invaders. Not your bile throwing a tantrum. Still, let's not judge too harshly when you're sick. Today, you might light a scented candle, brew a strange tea you saw on TikTok, and wrap yourself in blankets while binging 8 hours of true crime. Deep down, the impulse isn't so different. Seek comfort, create ritual, do something. That was Rome's genius, making illness part of daily life. They built entire social systems around it. You didn't hide away when you were sick. You steamed, you bathed. You complained loudly in marble halls and had strangers rub scented oil on your chest while a harp played in the background. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real lesson here. In a world where the cure for the common cold is still waited out, maybe what we need isn't more pills or powders. Maybe it's more bathhouses, eucalyptus, steam, and communal whining under mosaics of Jupiter, minus the owl brains. Now, welcome to the medieval period, also known as humanity's extended fever dream of dirt, dread, and leeches. Let's set the tone. It's 1347. The bubonic plague is doing its best impression of a traveling rock band, selling out entire towns 1 week at a time. Peasants are dying by the cartload, nobles are dying slightly more glamorously, and somewhere, a man with a giant feather in his hat is praying that sneezing doesn't count as witchcraft. Into this hot mess of superstition, religious panic, and chronic trenchfoot walks the common cold, the underachieving younger sibling of medieval death. Not terrifying enough to be called the Black Death, but annoying enough to make a monk miss Vespers. And here's the twist. Despite everything going on, famine, pestilence, illiteracy, the cold still got treated like a legitimate threat. Because nothing disrupts your feudal suffering like a clogged nostril. In the medieval mind, illness was either a punishment from God, a trial sent to test your soul, or the result of having looked at the moon wrong. And since the germ theory was still approximately 500 years away, their approach to curing the cold was, let's say, creative. Let's start with the crowd pleaser, bloodletting. The logic was simple, if terrifying. If you were sick, something inside you had gone bad. Clearly, the most obvious solution was to open a vein and let the evil vibes drain out. Congested chest, open a vein in the arm. Headache, bleed from the temple. Sore throat, time to poke the foot. It's like trying to fix a flat tire by slowly deflating the other three. But it felt scientific. Barbers, yes, the same people who gave you bowl cuts, doubled as surgeons and bloodletters. That red and white barber pole. It represents bandages and arterial spray. Fun, let's follow our imaginary peasant, Elsbeth. She's 29, which is considered elderly by medieval standards. She's got a cold, a cough, fever, fatigue. Her local healer, an old woman named Brida, recommends the usual. Apply a hot stone to the chest. Drink broth made from boiled weeds. Ando, yes, have a priest bless the mucus. But Elsbeth's landlord insists on something more advanced. So they call for the local barber surgeon, who arrives with a leather pouch of knives and a vaguely threatening grin. He sniffs her breath, mutters imbalanced humors, and opens a vein in her forearm while chanting a psalm. She faints. He feels satisfied. You'll feel right as rain by sunset, he says, as the family mops up her blood with the good linens. Meanwhile, leeches become the go-to for the wealthy, the medieval equivalent of boutique therapy. Physicians believed that leeches were more refined than knives, less traumatic, more targeted. So, if you were rich and phlegmy, you'd get a bowl of warm water, a silk pillow, and a handful of bloodsuckers to gently caress your inner elbow. Nothing says aristocracy like being drained alive, while sipping clove wine. But the bleeding was just the beginning. Let's talk about herbal poultices. The original Vicks VapoRub, except instead of menthol, it was usually fermented animal fat and crushed lavender. Applied directly to the chest, it was believed to draw out the illness, or at least cover up the stench of your slowly decaying peasant hovel. Another popular cure, hot iron on the tongue. Yup, if you had a sore throat or persistent cough, a blacksmith would heat a poker until it glowed. Then, gently, and by gently, we mean horrifyingly, tap it against your tongue to burn out the sickness. Because nothing heals like third-degree oral burns. Still not charred enough. Try smoke fumigation, a medieval method involving burning herbs, or, in some places, dung, in a closed room while the patient inhaled deeply. This wasn't just a cure, it was a spiritual detox. Sure, you came out smelling like scorched cabbage and horse barn, but at least you were cleansed, or dead. It was a coin toss, but nothing beat the sheer madness of the holy relic cure. If your cold was persistent, it wasn't just an illness, it was a spiritual failing. The church, ever helpful, suggested touching the bone of a saint. Or if you couldn't afford that, gazing upon the toenail of a bishop who once met a saint. Some monasteries had entire relic rooms filled with saint fragments, all lovingly labelled and encased in gold. A sniffly noble might kneel before the Muller of St. Eustace, while monks chanted and incense choked the room. Did it help? Unlikely. But at least it made your death spiritually Instagram, Mabel. And of course, we can't forget the sweat cure. Bundle yourself in layers of fur and wool, down a goblet of mulled vinegar, then lie in a hot room while servants pour broth into your mouth and whisper Latin affirmations. This was both a treatment and an accidental way to cook a human being. Why? The obsession with heat. Because cold illnesses were considered a sign of cold humors. Too much phlegm, remember? So the response was to overheat the body until it either expelled the phlegm or melted into a puddle of regret. It's like trying to unfreeze your windshield with a flower, AMETHROWER. And if none of that worked, you could always rely on prayer and weeping. Which brings us to the emotional heart of medieval cold cures: fear. People were terrified of illness, not just because of death, but because of what sickness represented: spiritual weakness, divine judgment, social failure. To be sick was to be impure. To sneeze in church was to risk public suspicion. To cough in winter was to invite gossip. That you were possessed, cursed, or both. Imagine living in a world where you had to apologize for sneezing, lest your neighbors report you to the local priest. Bless you wasn't politeness. It was urgent divine intervention. And don't even get me started on the plague confusion syndrome. During outbreaks of plague, every cold became a potential death sentence. A cough in the wrong town square could get you quarantined, shunned, or dumped in a ditch by enthusiastic villagers with pitchforks and a vague understanding of epidemiology. The result? People hid their symptoms. They whispered about the sickness like it was Voldemort. They self-medicated with whatever herbs, amulets, or liquors they could afford, and many simply waited it out, shivering in silence, hoping the fever would pass before the priest did. But even in the darkest times, there was a strange comfort in the chaos. Imagine sitting by a smoky fire, wrapped in furs, sipping onion broth, while your grandmother rubs garlic paste on your feet and mutters a blessing. Outside, the wind howls. The village is quiet. You're sick, yes, but you're held, tended to, loved, in a weird, smelly, burning sage kind of way. For all its horrors, the medieval world had rituals of care. Illness brought families together. It slowed life down. It carved space for stillness, reflection, maybe even a little tenderness between bloodlettings. And when someone got better, even from something as simple as a cold, it was cause for celebration. Proof that you'd endured, that God had spared you, that your goat-fat poultice had worked, or at least hadn't killed you yet. So the next time you're wrapped in a blanket, watching reality TV, sipping overpriced tea from a novelty mug shaped like a fox, spare a thought for Elsbeth and her medieval comrades. They didn't have any. They had fire, fear, and fermented leek wine, but they got through it, somehow, and in the quiet ache of a modern sick day, with your smartphone by your side and 1,000 distractions ready to stream you back to health, you might just miss the simplicity of it all, the crackle of the fire, the ritual of the cure, the prayer whispered over broth, the feeling that, despite everything, you were part of something older than your fever. Let that sink in, even with a nose full of mucus. You're not alone. It's the 1600s. The Renaissance is blooming in some parts of Europe. Science is poking its head cautiously out from behind the church's very flammable curtain. And across the continent, people are still treating the common cold with boiling urine and a small, healthy dose of hysteria. Because if your neighbor sneezes in the morning and you trip on a rock by noon, clearly, witchcraft, welcome to the era of magical thinking, herbal healers, and women burned at the stake because someone coughed too hard after dinner, where the line between physician and executioner was often one bad sneeze away. Let's set the stage. In a cold Scottish village, a woman named Agnes wakes up, feeling ... off scratchy throat, slight chills. It's nothing, really. Maybe a cold. Maybe just the relentless damp air conspiring against her joints. She wraps herself in a shawl, tends to her hearth, and says good morning to her neighbor, Fraser, who is hauling hay and looking especially miserable. That afternoon, Fraser comes down with a nasty cough. That evening, he tells his wife, who tells her cousin, who tells the town. You know, Fraser didn't start coughing until after Agnes said hello. By the following week, Agnes is standing in front of a tribunal explaining that, no, she has not made a pact with the devil to spread sore throats. But it's too late. The cold has officially become contagious, witchery. In early modern Europe, illness, including the extremely non-lethal sniffle, was still tightly bound to spiritual forces. For centuries, the church had held a monopoly on illness. If you got sick, it was either a test from God or a punishment for sin. But when logic failed and the priest's Latin got stale, blame moved down the food chain, right to women, wise women, midwives, and herbalists. Often the only healthcare available to the poor were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Their folk remedies, garlic salves, elderberry syrups, mulled wine poultices, worked just well enough to make people uncomfortable. And if those remedies failed, well, clearly they'd poisoned you. It's a lose-lose situation wrapped in lavender, oil, and fatal misogyny. You heal a child's cold with rosemary steam, which the child dies anyway, which the child gets better. But the neighbor's goat catches pneumonia. Triple witch, burn immediately, no trial necessary. This wasn't isolated paranoia. In places like Salem, Wurzburg, and Bamberg, entire communities lost their minds over mysterious ailments, often common colds, fevers, or headaches, and executed dozens of people under the banner of purging evil. Sneezing in public could be interpreted as a curse. A hot forehead, possession, runny nose, hexed sinuses. In 1590, Anne Kendrick, a woman in Yorkshire, was accused of making her neighbor unwell in the lungs after borrowing a thimble and not returning it fast enough. The neighbor's cold worsened. Anne's fate, trial by ducking. She was tied to a stool and dunked in a freezing river until the spirits or her lungs gave up. Spoiler, the cold wasn't the killer, but not everyone was setting people on fire. In more pragmatic circles, the spiritual cold took a gentler form. Charms and amulets. These were pocket-sized talismans, blessed by priests or folk healers, believed to protect against illness. Some had Bible verses etched into copper. Others were wrapped in herbs and linen, worn around the neck or tucked under pillows. It was spiritual Vicks Vaporub, only with more Latin and fewer menthol crystals. One popular charm from 17th century France read, "Protect me, Saint Blaise, from sore throat and foul breath. May no demon steal my breath, nor freeze my chest in winter's grip." Now that's a tagline. And Saint Blaise, patron saint of sore throats. Yes, really. He was a bishop who once miraculously cured a boy choking on a fishbone, and thus earned eternal responsibility for everyone with the sniffles. On his feast day, priests would bless people's throats by crossing 2 lit candles under their chins. Warm, comforting, and only slightly flammable. Meanwhile, back in the village, not all magical thinking was tragic. There were cozy rituals too. Blanket cures, for example. Villagers believed that if you wrapped a sick person in 7 blankets, then whispered a rhyme while burning bay leaves on the hearth, you could sweat the evil out. Sure, it was a fire hazard, but it worked, sort of. Sweating does raise the body's temperature, which can fight off some viruses. Accidentally medieval science. There were also midnight teas, brewed from elderflower, sage, and catnip, sipped in silence by candlelight. The afflicted would be tucked into bed, while someone, usually a grandmother, with a voice like cracked stone, murmured protective words passed down through generations. Did these teas cure colds? Not exactly. Did they comfort the sick, warm the spirit, and slow the heart rate until sleep arrived? Absolutely. And then, of course, there were the dream rituals. If someone had a persistent cold, it was believed their spirit was caught in the veil between worlds. To fix this, a healer might sleep beside the patient, hoping to intercept their dreams and bargain with the illness. What did that look like? Picture two people snoring in a smoky room full of rosemary while a third chants over a bowl of salted milk. Weird. Yes, but also weirdly beautiful. Because even in a world dominated by fear and firewood, there was tenderness. Even when science failed, people tried. They lit candles, wrapped blankets, shared warmth, told stories, all in the name of fighting. Something they couldn't see, and that matters. Because the cold wasn't just physical. It was symbolic, a reminder of human frailty, of the thin line between wellness and ruin. In those days, surviving winter was an achievement. Living through illness was a narrative arc, and every cough, every sneeze, was woven into the mythos of your village, your family, your soul. Of course, not every cure was harmless. Some rituals went from cozy to catastrophic fast. There's a recorded case in 1633 of a village in Bohemia where the local healer insisted that everyone with a cold bury a clove of garlic under a full moon. When one man forgot and caught pneumonia, they blamed him for opening the veil and burned his entire barn down. So yes, things escalated. But through it all, there's something unmistakably human here. A need to assign meaning to suffering. A drive to control the uncontrollable. Whether by chant, charm, or chamomile, people faced illness not with resignation, but with ritual, and in those rituals, something profound was passed down. Resilience wrapped in superstition. Strength disguised as spell work. Even today, echoes of that era linger. When we light a candle for a loved one. When we whisper, "Bless you," after a sneeze. When we brew that family tea recipe and believe, deep down, it still works, even if science disagrees. So tonight, if you're curled under a blanket, fighting off a cough, wondering if another dose of vitamin C will save you, pause. Remember Agnes. Remember Saint Blaise. Remember the whispered rhymes and bay leaves and salt circles. Not because they cured the cold, but because they reminded people they weren't alone in it. Sometimes, the real medicine is belief. Even when it smells like garlic and goat milk, there's something uniquely satisfying about watching rich, powerful people suffer from the same nonsense as the rest of us. Case in point, the common cold. It didn't care if you wore a crown or cleaned chamber pots. From paupers to princes, phlegm was the great equalizer. But when kings caught the sniffles, it wasn't just a cold. It was a full-blown political crisis, wrapped in ermine and sneezed upon by a courtier. Because royalty didn't just get sick. They got medically overanalyzed by 12 bearded men in robes who believed your humors were misaligned with Venus. In the name of prestige and national security, monarchs were subjected to the most bizarre, expensive, and occasionally lethal cures that money, paranoia, and powdered gems could buy. Let's begin with the absolute icon of medical melodrama, King Henry VIII, a man who, at any given moment, was one wife away from a felony and one fever away from declaring war on France. Henry was famously not in peak health. By the time he hit middle age, he had open leg ulcers, chronic digestive issues, and a body that basically wheezed in iambic, Pentameter. So when Henry caught a cold, his royal physicians would descend like vultures on a banquet to cure. A steaming mustard poultice applied to the chest, followed by a bath in wine infused with cinnamon, rose petals, and for good measure, powdered pearls. Because what's the point of medicine if it doesn't bankrupt your enemies? On top of that, Henry insisted that his bedding be changed twice daily, his feet be rubbed with goose fat, and his room be fumed with incense made from imported Arabian resins and dried figs. And if you dared sneeze in his presence, that was treason-adjacent behavior. Executions have happened for less. But Henry wasn't the only monarch whose sinuses caused international tension. Fast forward to France. Catherine de' Medici, queen, power broker, and pharmaceutical enthusiast, had her own go-to cold remedy: crushed pearls dissolved in vinegar, drunk slowly while seated under a velvet canopy. The idea was that pearls, being both rare and sacred, could cool the humors and restore balance. It didn't work, but it looked fabulous. Royal treatments weren't about science, they were about optics. If the king sniffled, the nation shivered. And so, every tickle in the throat became a geopolitical affair. Which brings us to Louis XIV, the Sun King, and a man who turned getting sick into theatre. Louis was obsessed with ceremony. So when he developed a persistent nasal condition, historians believe it was rhinitis, possibly worsened by powdered wigs, and Versailles indoor pollen count rivaling a greenhouse. He called in every physician in Paris. The solution? Nasal surgery in public, yes. In full view of the court, Louis had a physician insert a silver tube into his nose to clear the blockage. There was no anesthesia, just the dulcet tones of violins and the horrified faces of nobility. Blood dripped. The king winced. Applause was reportedly polite. What a show. This moment served two purposes: demonstrate Louis's divine resilience and remind everyone that yes, he too could bleed, but gracefully, across the Channel. The British royals were no less dramatic. Queen Elizabeth I had a more subtle approach. She believed colds were caused by ill vapors, and so demanded her chambers be constantly perfumed with burning herbs, rosemary, sage, and lavender. Her physicians recommended regular bloodletting, but she politely declined. Her version of a cure: gargling red wine mixed with crushed sapphires. Very on brand. And if the commoners couldn't afford gems for their sore throats, well, maybe they should have tried being born in a palace. Meanwhile, in Russia, Tsar Peter the Great had a less delicate approach. If a nobleman complained of being ill, even with a minor cold, Peter would often force them to drink entire jugs of vodka as a tonic, then drag them into an icy river to purge the weakness. This was less medicine, more hazing. But for Peter, illness was treason. Against masculinity. You weren't allowed to cough unless it came with a war cry. Let's not forget the royal obsession with exotic imports. In the 17th and 18th centuries, anything foreign was considered medicinal. Chinese ginseng, Turkish opium, South American cocoa. These items were less about efficacy and more about status-infused placebo. Kings drank teas worth more than most towns, just to soothe a tickle in their throat. And then there were the court physicians, a class of people whose entire job was to keep the monarch alive, or at least convincingly not dead. These men were educated, yes, but they were also yes-men. If the king wanted leeches on his eyebrows, that's what he got. And if the queen wanted her sneezes red as omens, well, pass the prophecy manual. Court physicians had to balance real medicine, astrology, political intrigue, and personal survival. A wrong diagnosis could get you dismissed, disgraced, or discreetly poisoned. So naturally, their cold treatments were a mix of real herbs and desperate theatrics. Let's imagine a royal sick day. The king wakes up with a sore throat. Immediate response: seal the palace gates, cancel all meetings, summon the privy physician. The diagnosis: excess wind in the throat. Treatment: warm mulled wine, bloodletting, a prayer vigil, and possibly whispering to a saint's toe. The queen, not to be outdone, orders a sapphire-infused gargle and demands her pillow be filled with rosemary and swan feathers. Meanwhile, a lowly servant, sneezing in the hall, is beaten for airborne insolence. It's like Downton Abbey meets a hospital drama written by people who think coughing is a sin. The irony: most of these cures didn't work, but some accidentally helped. Honey and herbs, good. Warm baths, excellent. Isolation, effective. Unfortunately, they usually combine that with mercury pills, leeches, or diamonds ground into wine, which diluted the progress with a healthy splash of nonsense. Yet despite the madness, there's a kind of poetic symmetry to it all. When a royal got sick, the entire world tilted slightly. Physicians whispered, courtiers prayed, peasants gossiped. Wars were postponed, marriages delayed, succession lines debated, because the most powerful people in the world could still be taken down, not by assassins, but by mucus. It was both hilarious and humbling, because no matter how many castles you build, how many portraits you commission, or how many jewels you ingest in the name of wellness, the human body still revolts. You still cough, you still ache, you still need a blanket, some broth, and someone to pretend your sneeze was majestic in a strange way. These royal remedies reflect the deepest human desire, to make suffering feel important. If we can't stop the cold, maybe we can at least wrap it in velvet and make it wear a crown. So next time you're sipping tea under a hoodie, watching reruns with tissues stuffed in your sleeves, remember, you're not just sick, you're regal. Let's head west. It's the 18th century now. The era of powdered wigs, revolutions, and deeply unqualified men selling bottles of medicinal elixir out of the back of horse-drawn carriages. The air smells like gunpowder, damp wood, and suspicious herbs. And when colonists got the sniffles, science took a little vacation, and a carnival of cures rolled into town wearing a velvet vest and carrying a Bible in one hand and a bottle of poison in the other. Welcome to colonial America, where the cure for the common cold could be anything, from mercury-infused lozenges to the lingering belief that sin, spirits, or foul air was behind every sneeze. And more often than not, the guy recommending it had no idea what a virus was, but he'd absolutely sell you a cure for 1 or 5. We begin with the quintessential symbol of this era's medical enthusiasm, the traveling medicine man. You've seen the archetype: straw hat, fancy coat, dramatic mustache, bottles clinking in his trunk. He'd set up shop in the middle of town square, stand on a crate, and yell things like, "Ladies and gentlemen, gather round. Are you tired of your rheumatism, consumption, catarrh, melancholy, or phlegm? Well then, Dr. Elmer P. Wickham's miracle serum will cure what ails you for the low price of your trust, your savings, and possibly your liver." These men, and occasionally women, sold snake oil, a term that would go on to define an entire genre of fake medicine. Ironically, the original snake oil, imported from China and made from actual snake fat, may have had some anti-inflammatory properties, but colonial snake oil, it was usually alcohol, turpentine, opium, cayenne, pepper, and blind optimism, which, incidentally, is also the flavor profile of most early American cocktails. These miracle cures claimed to fix everything: colds, sore throats, tuberculosis, broken hearts, moral failings, and sometimes even the vague sadness that visits during harvest season. They came with testimonials, usually fabricated. My Aunt Margaret had one foot in the grave until she drank this tonic, and now she churns butter like a teenager. And the best part, if it didn't work, you didn't die from the illness, you died from the cure. Problem solved. But quacks weren't the only ones in the game. Colonial physicians, the legit medical professionals of the day, were often just as hazardous. They trained in Europe, read from medical tomes written by men who thought the uterus wandered the body like a confused jellyfish, and mostly prescribed what they called heroic medicine. Translation: bleeding, purging, blistering, or poisoning you into submission. Got a cold? Take calomel, a mercury-based laxative that would purge the toxins. Mercury, as in the shiny silver stuff that ruins your nervous system and makes your gums fall out. Mercury was in everything: pills, powders, lozenges. You couldn't sneeze without someone offering you a mercury muffin and a cheerful pat on the back. And it didn't stop there. Other remedies included tobacco smoke. Enemas, yes, literal tobacco smoke, pumped into the rectum using a bellows. The logic: stimulate the system. The reality: light internal barbecue, laudanum, opium, mixed with alcohol. Popular among the wealthy writers, and anyone who wanted to sleep through their symptoms, and also reality itself. Tar water, a delightful mix of pine tar and spring water, sold as a general cure-all. It mostly cured your appetite. Let's not forget the homegrown cures, passed down from folk medicine and Native American traditions, which were often far more gentle and occasionally effective. Colonists adopted remedies like willow bark tea, a precursor to aspirin, elderberry syrup for coughs, hot foot baths for congestion, unions under the bed less effective. But at least it kept vampires away, or possibly everyone. But of course, those traditions were often ignored or dismissed by the scientific elite in favor of things like cupping, vomiting, or drinking blue vitriol, which is copper sulfate dissolved in water, also known as a bad idea in a glass dot in Puritan New England. Illness had moral weight. If you got sick, it wasn't just unfortunate, it was a judgment. People whispered, what sin had you committed? Were you secretly slothful? Had you missed a sermon? Sickness was punishment, and the only acceptable cure was repentance, prayer, and possibly being exorcised by a guy named Ezekiel who smelled like turnips. But not everyone was so dour. Ben Franklin, for example, was a cold-curing enthusiast. He swore by air baths, standing nude in front of an open window each morning to refresh the body. He also loved sipping hot lemon and honey, and recommended avoiding crowded rooms where one man's sneeze might become 100 men's. Suffering, Ben Franklin, founding father, newspaper mogul, and the first guy to say, maybe don't lick doorknobs. Let's take a closer look at a typical colonial cold sufferer, Abigail, a school teacher in Boston. She wakes up with a sore throat and mild fever. Her options: visit the town doctor, who will offer a mercury tonic and possibly leech her face. Send a servant to the general store for healing tincture No. 9, which contains more alcohol than logic. Brew her grandmother's cough tea made from molasses, licorice root, and lemon.b accused of spiritual uncleanliness and quarantined in the barn. Abigail wisely chooses the tea, adds a splash of rum, and prays no one smells it. Meanwhile, her neighbor Silas is enthusiastically snorting ground mustard, in the belief that it will shock the sinuses into obedience. He collapses on the floor. No one helps him because everyone thinks he's doing repentance calisthenics. This was the state of health in the colonies, a mix of desperate hope, terrifying medicine, and DIY remedies passed down by grandmothers who knew that if you boiled anything long enough, it might eventually feel like healing. And, again, we see the same pattern: rituals, steam, soup, isolation, sweating it out, suffering with dignity, all cloaked in religion, suspicion, and a very liberal interpretation of the word cure. The thing is, people meant well, even the quacks, even the mercury peddlers. Everyone was chasing relief, some with herbs, others with high-octane poison. It wasn't about getting rich, okay? For some, it definitely was, but at the core, it was about control. The cold was unknowable, untouchable, so if you could tame it with a bottle, a ritual, a prayer, or a potion made by a man in a questionable vest, maybe the world made a little more sense. Maybe you didn't feel so helpless. And that's the through line, again and again. From priests to physicians, peasants to presidents, humans have always tried to conquer colds with whatever tools they had. Sometimes it was garlic, sometimes it was God, sometimes it was ground glass in a bottle labeled soothing elixir. It didn't matter. What mattered was doing something. So next time you're sipping herbal tea, scrolling online for yet another article on 10 natural cold cures that actually work, remember, you're following in a long tradition of desperate, sniveling ancestors who trusted the man in the hat with the shiny bottle. Let's just hope yours doesn't contain mercury. Okay, let's pause. If you're still here, curled up under a blanket, possibly halfway through a questionable herbal tea, listening to stories about medieval leech therapy and powdered pearls up royal noses, well, first off, respect. You've made it farther than half the people who walk into a pharmacy looking for the strongest thing that's not technically illegal. You've also proven something important. You're part of this. Part of the phlegmy, shivering, garlic-smeared history of cold sufferers who all had the same thought: there's got to be a better way than this, and proceeded to try everything except leaving the cold alone. We've journeyed through empires and amulets, past priests and pearl-infused wine, into the mud-slick trenches of superstition and early medicine, and we've barely scratched the tip of humanity's mucus-covered iceberg. So, still watching? Then you know what to do, no pressure. Of course. But, if you've laughed, winced, or blinked slowly while whispering, "Wait, they put what up their nose?" this is your gentle nudge. Subscribe, like, leave a comment about the weirdest cold remedy your family still swears by. We all have one. Someone's grandma is probably rubbing Vicks on their feet right now, because the rest of this story, it only gets weirder and darker and more disturbingly cozy. We've got Victorian drugstores with opium candy. We've got war era menthol grease. We've got an entire chapter on why putting garlic in your nose is probably not the revolutionary life hack TikTok promised you. But more importantly, we've got you, still here, still listening, still breathing probably through one nostril, still riding this absurdly human wave of rituals, remedies, and respiratory regrets. So take a moment, adjust your blanket, sip your tea, and let this sink in. Across centuries, across continents, billions of people have sat exactly where you are. Now, tired, sick, curious, searching for comfort in smoke, in soup, in stories. You're not alone. You never were. And yes, the next chapter has heroin cough syrup in it. Just saying. The Victorian era, that polished age of corsets, cobblestones, empire, and decorum. A time when men wore pocket watches and monocles, unironically women fainted recreationally, and underneath all that civility, everyone was absolutely sloshed on opium and snorting cocaine for their cough. Yes. Really, let's enter the parlor. It's 1883. A child is coughing. The nanny, distressed but composed, reaches for a tin marked Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. On the label, a cherubic baby, a gentle promise, and an ingredient list that omits the two most relevant facts. It's loaded with morphine and probably lethal in large doses. Welcome to the golden age of pharmaceutical optimism, where the factory revolution met medical guesswork, and every symptom was a business opportunity. We'll begin with cough syrup, a quaint term for what was often a liquid sedative cocktail laced with narcotics. You see, the Victorians were obsessed with solving problems. Their motto was basically, why suffer when you can drink laudanum and pretend everything's fine? Which is ironic, because the Victorian aesthetic is suffering. But they wanted their suffering to be dignified, and if possible, numbed with tinctures from bottles etched with ivy and cursive font. Let's talk about laudanum, the era's over-the-counter MVP. Invented in the 1600s, but perfected and mass-produced in the 1800s, laudanum was a mix of alcohol and powdered opium. It was marketed as a painkiller, cough suppressant, sleep aid, and general-purpose life lubricant. Prescribed to babies, widows, soldiers, poets, basically anyone with a pulse and a complaint. Catch a cold. Laudanum. Lose your appetite. Laudanum, feeling existential dread and a mild cough. 2 spoons of laudanum, darling, and a poem. It worked. Of course it worked. You were literally high. But like all good things, there was a cost. Addiction rates soared. People started dying quietly, politely, sometimes with excellent penmanship, from what newspapers vaguely referred to as over-medication. Still, the ads kept coming. No more night sweats. Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops bring peace to the consumptive chest. Infants cry for soothing syrup, now with extra morphia. Because if a toddler won't sleep, why not chemically knock them out for 12 hours? It gets worse. Enter Vin Mariani, a French tonic that combined red wine with cocaine. Yes, cocaine. This wasn't fringe. It was endorsed by Pope Leo XIII, who carried a flask of it and gave Mariani a medal. For spiritual clarity, he said. Even Queen Victoria was fond of coca-based tonics, and not in a scandalous, tabloid way, in a very afternoon-tea-with-a-side- of stimulants sort of way. No one blinked. It was all very proper, but not all cold cures came in a bottle. Victorian apothecaries were sensory overloads of jars, powders, and dubious promises. You'd walk in with a sore throat and be offered chlorodyne, part chloroform, part opium, part whatever was lying around. Belladonna lozenges, made from deadly nightshade, meant to dry the sinuses, and possibly your will to live. Ammonia steam inhalers, that's right. Snorting cleaning fluid on purpose. Sulfur sticks, lit and waved near the face to burn out the infection. Also useful for summoning demons. And then there were the electrotherapy devices. Because why? Just drink your medicine, when you could shock your cold into submission. Victorian inventors created all sorts of gadgets, chest plates, wired gloves, and even nasal electrodes, all powered by early batteries, all claiming to invigorate the blood and expel congestion. In reality, they just gave you a mild tingle and possibly a static fried mustache. Let's pause for a cozy fictional scene. Eleanor, a genteel woman of 34, with a fondness for pressed flowers and strong tea, wakes up with a raspy cough. She rings for the maid, who brings her a velvet box. Inside, chlorodyne drops, a mustard plaster, and a pamphlet titled The Gentlewoman's Guide to Winter Afflictions. Eleanor sips her syrup, her breathing slows, her eyes flutter. She dreams of spring. By morning, the cold is gone. Or maybe her memory of it is. Hard to tell. This was the Victorian approach. Romanticize the illness. Turn it into art. Wrap your suffering in lace and poetry. You weren't just sick, you were delicate, tragic, a Victorian heroine coughing elegantly into a handkerchief embroidered with lilies. Even the advertisements played along. Popular poster for a cocaine toothache drop showed a small child smiling blissfully, holding the dropper with the tagline, "They'll ask for it again," which was accurate, if a bit too honest. But behind the opulent labels and soft focus ads was a darker truth. Children died. Addictions festered. Families became reliant on tonics that numbed symptoms without ever treating causes. The medical profession started to fracture between the old guard of tonic sellers and the new wave of skeptical, reform-minded doctors, trying desperately to apply actual science. This tension birthed something new. Regulation. By the late 19th century, reformers began pushing back. Journalists exposed the worst offenders. Scientists analyzed ingredients. Governments, slowly, cautiously, started banning the more outrageous concoctions. By 1906, the US passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, forcing companies to label what was actually in the bottle. A revolutionary concept. Honesty. The golden age of mystery syrups began to dim, but let's not pretend it disappeared entirely. Many of the remedies persisted, just repackaged. Codeine replaced laudanum. Cocaine got sanitized into invigorating powders. Alcohol-heavy syrups quietly evolved into the over-the-counter cough syrups we still sip today. Same ritual, less poetry, fewer funerals, and yet part of us still misses it. Not the death, obviously, but the drama. The idea that a cold was something worth treating with velvet gloves and French glass bottles, that illness had ceremony, that recovery involved plush sofas, soft lighting, and a tincture so strong it made you forget you had a nose at all. Because today, we take a pill, scroll our phones, and binge TV through a haze of menthol. No handwritten prescriptions, no whispered cures, no Pope-sponsored wine tonics, just digital thermometers and expired lozenges at the bottom of your backpack. But maybe, just maybe, there's still a place for a little Victorian ritual in our healing. A mug of something warm, a flickering candle, a moment to pause and say, I'm unwell, and I deserve to feel like the heroine of my own recovery arc. Just maybe skip the cocaine. Let's step away from the powdered wigs and velvet couches of Victorian high society and take a long, soothing walk down a dirt road towards something earthier, warmer, spicier, more flammable, because while doctors in cities were prescribing syrups strong enough to knock out a rhino, out in the countryside, in villages, cabins, hollers, and huts, People relied on something far more powerful than morphine-laced cough drops. Grandma, yes, that grandma. The one with the suspicious jar of something cloudy fermenting in the pantry. The one who didn't go to the doctor because she was the doctor and the pharmacist, the nurse, and, occasionally, the exorcist. This chapter is an ode to folk remedies. The cures whispered from generation to generation, unverified by science, but endorsed by experience, stubbornness, and the occasional ghost. These weren't written in textbooks. They were learned through family, community, survival, and stories told while stirring something that smelled suspiciously like regret and pine. And the star of this chapter, whiskey, or vodka, or rum, or whatever alcohol your ancestors had on hand when the sniffles arrived like an uninvited cousin. Let's begin in Appalachia, where settlers, farmers, and coal miners battled long winters with minimal medical access and maximum creativity. The cold. It wasn't a disease. It was a seasonal inevitability. You didn't treat it so much as survive it. And if you were lucky, you did so with a shot of something strong and a spoonful of something sticky. Recipe 1, hot toddy, equal parts whiskey, honey, lemon juice, hot water, and a quiet place to lie down and think about your sins. You drink it before bed. You sweat. You hallucinate a little. You wake up feeling either better or so dehydrated you forget you were sick. In some families, the toddy was a cure-all: toothache, toddy's fever, toddy's existential dread at the collapsing structure of frontier life. To toddy's grandmothers insisted the alcohol drove out the cold. And while that's not medically true, it's also not entirely wrong. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, numbs the throat, and makes you care a whole lot less about your runny nose. Science adjacent, if you squint. But Appalachia wasn't alone in this. In Eastern Europe, babushkas made garlic. Vodka, you mash raw garlic. Let it steep in vodka for 3 days. Take a shot, then cry. Not because it hurts, though it does, but because you can now smell colors and taste the ghosts of your ancestors, judging your immune system across the Nordic countries. You'll find glögg, a hot mulled wine spiced with cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, and attitude, traditionally consumed during long winters. It's not marketed as medicine, but if you ask your grandma, it opens the chest, clears the soul, and helps you forget you've been coughing since November. In Mexico, there's té de canela, con tequila cinnamon tea with a splash of tequila, sometimes garnished with lime, often consumed next to a glowing candle, and someone who knows how to make exactly the right soup in China. Centuries-old traditions. Blend herbs, ginger, and rice wine in recipes meant to balance your ki, warm your insides, and leave you slightly buzzed and spiritually upright. From the Amazon to the Alps, alcohol was both medicine and ritual. It wasn't about getting drunk, okay? Sometimes it absolutely was. But mostly, it was about feeling cared for, wrapped in warmth, invited to rest, given permission to be human, frail, and slightly flammable. But it wasn't all booze and bonfires. Let's talk about the dry remedies, things your grandma did that had no ingredients, just vibes. The sock method. Put onions in your socks. Why? It draws out the sickness. Is that real? No. Does it feel like you're doing something? Yes. And sometimes, that's enough. The mustard wrap. Mix mustard powder with flour and water into a paste. Slather it on a cloth. Apply it to your chest. Wait until you feel a burning that's probably more distracting than the cold itself. Remove before skin damage. Ideally, vapor tenting. Boil a pot of herbs, mint, rosemary, thyme, then drape a towel over your head and breathe the steam like you're making soup with your face. Some of these remedies worked, some didn't, but all of them felt like medicine. They required effort, they created space, they signaled care, and most importantly, they involved time. Unlike a pill you pop and forget, these remedies made you slow down, sit by the fire, listen. 2 stories, sleep under 6 quilts, let the world move without you for a while, because you were busy healing. Let's zoom in. Georgia, 1931. A farmhouse, rain tapping against the windows. A child, feverish, restless, coughs into a flannel. Pillow. Her grandmother lights the stove, boils water, adds honey, lemon, whiskey. She sings softly, a lullaby half in English, half in something older. She sits beside the child, stroking her hair, murmuring comfort. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, a kind of magic happens. Not the kind that comes in bottles, but the kind passed hand to hand, voice to voice. Healing disguised as bedtime. Love disguised as ritual. And this wasn't just rural. In urban immigrant communities, folk remedies followed families across oceans. Jewish grandmothers swore by chicken soup with dill and garlic. Italian nonas made fennel tea with honey and a warning. Irish grannies poured hot water over grated ginger, served with toast, and a guilt trip about not wearing your scarf in every culture. The cold became a shared enemy, and the cure became community. So yes, it's easy to mock these old cures. They're unscientific, untested, sometimes absurd. But they weren't just about curing symptoms. They were about making illness bearable, human, even beautiful, because there's a comfort in being handed something warm, in being told, drink this, in feeling a hand on your forehead and knowing, for this moment, at least, someone else is holding the weight. So maybe, tonight, when your throat's a little raw and your head's a little heavy, skip the digital thermometer. Turn off the LED humidifier that looks like a mushroom spaceship. Instead, do what Grandma did. Boil something, add honey, wrap up, and remember, the best cold remedy might just be the sound of a voice saying, you'll feel better in the morning, even if it comes with whiskey. We're now in the 20th century, an era of trenches, telegrams, and tubercular coughs, echoing across a world, trying to burn itself to pieces and then stitch itself back together again. The 2 world wars were not just fought with bullets and bombs, they were also fought with germs. And while the cold itself wasn't a frontline killer, it still made itself known in the mud, in the bunkers, in the hospitals, and in every desperate mother's kitchen. This is where the myth of modern medicine really started to take shape. One menthol-scented smear at a time. Let's start with a date no one wants to remember. 1918, you know the one, the Spanish flu, on an outbreak so catastrophic it makes the common cold seem like a paper cut. But here's the twist. During the Spanish flu, people couldn't tell the difference between deadly influenza and a really bad cold. Not until it was far too late at first. It looked familiar, chills, cough, headache, fever, but then patients turned blue, suffocated, died within hours. In that shadow, any cough became terrifying, any sneeze, a potential death knell. And in that fear, the cold took on new symbolic weight, not fatal, but untrustworthy. The line between nuisance and nightmare was too thin to walk, so people treated colds with apocalyptic urgency. Masks were worn, yes, even then. Schools closed, churches shut down, Homemade remedies surged, and if you couldn't afford a doctor, you went back to what always worked: steam, whiskey, prayer, menthol, and superstition. Which brings us to a household name, Vicks VapoRub. Vicks didn't start as a juggernaut. In the late 1800s, it was just another mentholated salve made by a North Carolina pharmacist named Lunsford Richardson. His target, chest colds. His formula, a mix of menthol, camphor, eucalyptus oil, and petroleum jelly, aka everything that smells like your grandfather's medicine cabinet, in one greasy goop. By the time World War I hit, Vicks was everywhere. Soldiers rubbed it on their chests, under their noses, even on their feet, don't ask. Nurses swore by it. Mothers hoarded it. It became a comfort object as much as a treatment, a thing you could do while the world spun madly outside. No one cared if it worked perfectly. It felt like it did. It tingled. It opened the lungs. It carried the scent of care, and that mattered, because in war, colds were not just inconvenient, they were operational threats. Picture it, a trench in France, 1917, mud waist-deep, rain constant, lice celebrating like it's Mardi Gras. A young soldier named Thomas develops a cough. It starts mild. He barely mentions it. By day 3, it's deep, wet, rattling. He's still holding a rifle, but the chills are setting in. His commanding officer gives him a shot of brandy and a tin of Vicks. You'll be fine. He isn't. The cold turns into bronchitis, then into pneumonia. Within a week, Thomas is gone, not from enemy fire, but from something that started as a tickle in the throat. This wasn't rare. Respiratory illness claimed more soldiers than shrapnel, and because medical technology was still limping behind, treatments were rudimentary. Hot tea, rest if you could get it, blankets if they weren't soaked, maybe a poultice, maybe prayer back home. Families received letters from the front describing not just battles, but symptoms. Caught a chill, sniffling again. Vicks helps. These small reports, tucked between lines of grief, kept the cold real, grounded, human. After the war, when soldiers returned, they brought Vicks with them. Sales exploded. Suddenly, menthol was the national smell of wellness. Parents kept it by the bed. Children hated it and trusted it in equal measure. You'd hear, "Go get the Vicks," more often than "I love you," especially in winter. But the 20th century wasn't done. Enter World War II, and a whole new chapter of cold warfare. This time, armies were prepared. Medical corps had better tools. Sulfur drugs, penicillin, X-rays, but colds still slithered through the ranks, unharmed by antibiotics and ignored by most officers until the sneezing reached epidemic levels. So soldiers were issued menthol lozenges in ration kits, salt tablets to prevent dehydration from fever, wool, scarves, standard issue, and of course, Vicks, still the reigning monarch of sinus relief. Back home, the culture of healing evolved. Radio shows aired sponsored segments about how to treat the winter sniffles. Advertisements showed fathers reading newspapers with Vicks on their chests, while mothers hovered nearby with hot tea and concern. The image of domestic recovery, warm, clean, disciplined, became the counter-narrative to the chaos of the outside world. And then came the branding revolution. Companies realized something. Colds weren't just a condition. They were a lifestyle, an identity, a seasonal phenomenon to be more necessary. So the cold was repackaged, from a low-level illness to an opportunity for products. Hence the rise of mentholated tissues so your snot had a tingle, electric humidifiers marketed as germ-slaying machines, mostly just added damp, closing parenthesis, cold-themed commercials, often starring animated bears, sympathetic mums, or incredibly chipper nurses with improbable hair. The message: the cold was beatable, manageable, part of life, but no longer scary. That cultural shift was huge, because, in the span of 40 years, the cold went from spiritual omen to manageable inconvenience, from sin of sin to get well soon, from trench threat to a reason to skip school and watch cartoons. And while the treatments didn't change that much, it was still hot drinks, rest, and menthol. The emotional framing did. You weren't cursed. You were cozy. You weren't weak. You were healing. You weren't contagious death. You were just under the weather. Let's revisit a post-war family. 1952. Suburbs. Snow outside. A child has a cold. Dad brings home a tin of Vicks. Mum makes chicken soup. The child is wrapped in a blanket, watching black and white TV, while the room smells faintly of pine and something medicinal. No one panics. No one prays to Saint Blaise. No one prays to Saint Blaise. No one calls the town doctor for leeches. They just ... Wait, it's not perfect. It's not high science, but it feels safe. That's the legacy of this era. Not a cure, but a rebranding. The cold is no longer existential. It's personal, familiar, tamed by product and ritual and scent, which, if you think about it, is kind of beautiful, because healing isn't always about eradicating the illness. Sometimes it's about reframing the experience, making it gentle, bearable, yours, so next time you feel that tickle, reach for the Vicks, not because it'll cure you, but because it carries the memory of a century's worth of people trying to make sickness a little more human. One greasy chest rub at a time. The post-World War II era ushered in not just a new geopolitical showdown, but also a golden age of pharmaceutical ambition, innovation, and let's be honest, some downright bizarre marketing. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles and espionage. It was about the race to conquer the common cold, the sneaky little enemy that refused to bow to science or ideology. Imagine it, two superpowers locked in a battle for global supremacy, while millions of ordinary people were locked in their homes, with sniffles and sore throats, armed with the latest wonder drugs, miracle lozenges, and suspiciously catchy jingles. The 1950s and 60s saw the rise of antihistamines, and the first real wave of over-the-counter cold medicines that promised relief without a trip to the doctor or a coat of leeches. Drug companies flooded the market with products designed not just to alleviate symptoms, but to convince you that you could fight back. There were pills for every symptom: sneezing, coughing, congestion, runny noses, watery eyes, and the ever-ominous general malaise. The packaging was bright, the names catchy, and the commercials impossibly cheerful. Who can forget those vintage ads with cartoon bears who sneezed so hard they literally blew their hats off? Always use Bear brand cold medicine, they chirped. It was medicine and entertainment rolled into one, but it wasn't all fluff and jingles. Behind the scenes, researchers were scrambling to understand the viruses responsible for colds. It was a tricky puzzle. Unlike bacteria, which could be cultured and targeted with antibiotics, viruses were elusive, tiny, and quick to mutate. The common cold was caused by dozens of different viruses, mostly rhinoviruses, and researchers were facing an uphill battle Yet, pharmaceutical companies didn't wait for a miracle cure. Instead, they developed symptom suppressants, drugs designed to make you feel better without curing the cold itself. Because let's be honest, if you can't cure it, at least make the misery manageable. One iconic example was the rise of pseudoephedrine, a decongestant that unclogged noses but came with its own baggage, including being a key ingredient in the production of illegal methamphetamine, turning pharmacies into battlefields of regulatory red tape. Then there was the introduction of antihistamines, originally developed for allergies, but quickly adapted to dry up runny noses and watery eyes. They were hailed as miracle workers, albeit with the side effect of turning users into couch potatoes. Sedation, the price of relief. But while medicine marched on, so did advertising creativity. Pharmaceutical marketing exploded on TV and radio. Ads featured smiling families, happy couples, and scientists in lab coats with reassuring smiles. Even if the medicine didn't quite deliver, a classic trope emerged. The busy parent fighting the cold to keep life running smoothly. "Don't let a cold slow you down," became the rallying cry. The message was clear. Colds were annoying but conquerable, as long as you had the right pill. Yet, for all the products and promises, the common cold remained undefeated. The real breakthrough wasn't a drug, but awareness. People learned to differentiate between colds, flu, allergies, and more serious infections. Public health campaigns emphasized hand-washing, rest, and hydration. Doctors cautioned against over-medicating, and new generations grew up knowing that sometimes the best cure was simply time. The 1960s and 70s also saw the rise of natural remedies marketed with a scientific sheen: echinacea, vitamin C, zinc supplements, each promising a shortcut to wellness in a bottle. The market exploded, blurring the lines between pharma and folklore, and the culture. It shifted. Colds became not just a physical nuisance, but a social inconvenience to be managed and hidden. People didn't want to be seen as weak or contagious, leading to a boom in cough and cold etiquette, covering your mouth, using tissues, and, increasingly, staying home from work. In offices, schools, and homes, the cold was now a known adversary, one that demanded respect, but not panic. Behind this cultural shift was a simple truth. Medicine had finally caught up to humility. It could ease symptoms. Yes, it could comfort, but it couldn't cure the cold. And so, the era ended with a cautious truce. The cold was here to stay. Pharma's golden age wasn't about triumph. It was about coexistence, mastering the art of living with illness, rather than vanquishing it today. The legacy of this era lives on in the aisles of every pharmacy, in every box of tissues, and every bottle of decongestant. Because sometimes, progress isn't about conquering the invisible enemy, it's about making peace with it, and that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. Let's push past the pharmacy shelves, step over the overhyped vitamin aisles, and walk into a kitchen. Because, honestly, this is where most colds actually get treated. Not in clinics or labs, but in homes, with recipes as old as time and as comforting as the smell of onions simmering on the stove. It's the era of chicken soup, the original, the unbeatable, the myth and the meme. Science has tried for decades to explain why this humble soup is the world's most beloved cold cure. Is it the steam, the salt, the gentle encouragement to just stop and breathe for once? Or is it the ritual, the act of someone, anyone, handing you a bowl with the implicit message, "I see you. You're worth this little bit of care"? But let's be honest, there's something magical about chicken soup, and that magic is about expectation. The placebo effect, the science of believing you're getting better and actually starting to feel it. Doctors in white coats have tested the stuff, analyzing everything from the sodium content to the viscosity of the broth. Their conclusion: it's ... fine. Maybe the heat helps loosen mucus. Maybe the protein helps you recover. Or maybe, just maybe, it's all about psychology. Placebo, a word that gets a bad rap. People think it means fake. But really, it means that the mind, when comforted, can nudge the body into healing a little bit faster, or at least into believing the healing is happening, which, in the misery of a cold, is often more than enough. Let's set a scene. A kid with a stuffy nose is lying on the couch, surrounded by crumpled tissues. Enter grandma, wielding a steaming bowl of chicken soup. The kid complains, sips, and soon the color returns to his cheeks. Did the soup fix his cold? Not exactly. But the warmth, the care, and the act of being noticed worked wonders. This is why every culture has a version of the healing soup. In Jewish households, it's matzo ball soup, Jewish penicillin, as some call it, with chicken, carrots, dill, and the secret ingredient, a grandmother's glare. In Vietnam, it's pho. In Korea, samji. In Latin America, caldo de pollo. Every spoonful comes with a little folklore and a lot of love. The ritual is always the same: boil, simmer, serve, and hope. But the placebo effect isn't just about soup. It's about any ritual that tells your brain you're going to be okay. Zinc lozenges, herbal teas, hot lemon water, that special blanket you only pull out when you're sick. These all create meaning, and meaning is what makes the misery bearable. Even modern science can't ignore this. Studies show that patients who believe in their treatment, who trust the process, who feel cared for, actually recover faster. Not because the medicine is better, but because the body's own healing systems get a boost when the mind is soothed. Which is why, in the age of miracle drugs and digital thermometers, the most popular cold advice is still rest, drink fluids, and let yourself be comforted. Of course, there's always the other side, the soup skeptics and the placebo police, who demand randomized controlled trials for every spoonful. They miss the point. Healing isn't always about proof. Sometimes it's about peace. Let's not forget the power of attention. A parent sits by a child's bedside, reading a book. A friend texts, "Get well soon." Someone makes tea, brings crackers, fluffs a pillow. The cold isn't cured, but the patient is less alone. In the end, the cold reminds us that we're human, vulnerable, in need of care. And sometimes, the best cure isn't found on a shelf, but in the gentle rituals of being looked after. So yes, sip your soup. Believe in your blanket. Light a candle if it helps. Because the line between chicken soup and placebo soup isn't as wide as we think. And in the soft glow of a kitchen lamp, with broth steaming and a cough slowly fading, maybe, just maybe, that's all the medicine we really need. Welcome to the 21st century, a place where the cutting edge of medical knowledge lives alongside some of the most facepalm-inducing advice ever captured on camera. If you thought the ancient Sumerians chanting over goat bile was peak weird, you clearly haven't seen the modern internet tell you to shove garlic up your nose for instant decongestion. This chapter is about our era, the digital carnival, the wellness boom, and the bizarre, beautiful, terrifying world of social media medicine. Because as much as we like to imagine ourselves as smarter than our ancestors, the truth is, humanity has simply traded priests for influencers and clay tablets for TikTok. Let's open the app. Your screen fills with DIY health hacks. An earnest 19-year-old wearing athleisure tells me to slice raw onions and leave them in your socks overnight to draw out toxins. Next up, a woman holding an essential oil roller, promising her blend will vibrate your sinuses into alignment. Then, a man with 8 million followers, sporting a man bun and suspicious confidence, tells you to snort hot pepper water because it hacks the immune system. It's chaos. It's hilarious. It's also a little dangerous, but it's nothing new. Throughout history, the desperate and the creative have always searched for a shortcut. The difference now is scale. A single bad idea can go viral in seconds. And before you can say CDC, millions are stuffing garlic up their nostrils, hoping to become the next immune system. Cinderella, let's break down a few viral cures. Garlic. In the nose, supposedly, this trick will clear your sinuses instantly. In reality, it just makes your nose run more because garlic is an irritant and might burn the delicate lining of your nose. Extra points for the garlic snot challenge, which is just what it sounds like. Onion in your sock. The theory. The skin on your feet is a magical portal for toxins. The reality. Your room just smells like onions, and the only thing being cleansed is your social life. Essential oil steam. Some oils can open your airways. Some can also cause rashes or even seizures if used improperly. But at least you'll smell expensive. As you cough, hot pepper water, spicy broths are fine in soup. But pouring capsaicin up your nose isn't a detox. It's a spicy ticket to regret and possibly your local urgent care. Raw honey shots, turmeric, smoothies, ginger chews. Actually, these can be soothing, as long as you're not allergic and aren't using them to replace actual medical treatment. Why do these trends spread? Partly because of influencer charisma, partly because of skepticism toward Big Pharma, and partly because, let's face it, colds are annoying, and will try anything to make them end faster. Enter the wellness influencer, modern-day shamans, in yoga pants, wielding ring lights and hashtag wisdom. Their medicine isn't just what's in the bottle. It's the ritual of watching, liking, sharing, and believing that you're part of a healing tribe. This is where ancient ritual meets algorithm. There's a comfort in it, too. During uncertain times, pandemics, anyone, people turn to community and ritual, whether it's a soup recipe or a viral hack. The rituals might have changed, but the impulse hasn't. Do something, try anything, tell your story, but there's a dark side. The line between quirky folk wisdom and medical misinformation is razor thin, and sometimes, tragically, people get hurt. There are stories of children hospitalized after parents followed online advice to pour silver colloid up their noses, of teens burning their skin with home-mixed essential oils, of desperate people foregoing real medicine for the hope of a quick fix. Medical professionals now spend as much time debunking viral nonsense as they do treating actual illness. And yet, the cycle repeats. Humans are endlessly inventive, endlessly hopeful, endlessly gullible. We want to believe that the solution is out there, just waiting to be liked and shared and hashtagged into our feeds. So, if you're scrolling through TikTok at 2 a.m., tissue box by your side, tempted to try whatever the top comment says, pause, remember. You are the latest in a long line of cold sufferers, each one willing to try anything for relief. Your ancestors burned herbs, drank opium syrup, rubbed whiskey on their chests. You might be wearing onions on your feet, but at least you're not being bled by a medieval barber. There's a kind of hope in all of it, an eternal belief in tomorrow's cure, in the wisdom of strangers, in the miracle just around the digital corner. So go ahead, watch, laugh, try safely, and share. Just maybe leave the garlic where it belongs, in the soup. Let's drop the garlic, close the TikTok tab, and take a slow, honest breath. We've snorted, sniffed, sipped, and sweated through centuries of absurdity, ingenuity, and desperation, only to arrive here in the 21st century with no cure. Billions of dollars, decades of research, and a million sneezing fits later, we still can't outwit the common cold. Why? The answer is both simple and infuriating. The common cold is not a single disease, but a riot of viruses over 200 different kinds, all evolving, mutating, swapping genetic tips like a viral sewing circle. Rhinoviruses, coronaviruses, adenoviruses, enteroviruses, each with dozens or hundreds of variants, each one waiting to ruin your day and your tissue budget. Imagine trying to design a universal key for 200 locks that keep changing shape. The flu is hard enough, but at least it stays in its lane. The cold, it's chaos with a diploma in disguise. Let's break it down. Burst, mutation. Cold viruses mutate rapidly. They change their outer proteins so fast that your immune system and any attempted vaccine can barely keep up. Today's cold is tomorrow's vintage strain. By the time scientists isolate one, 6 more have shown up to the party wearing new hats. Second, diversity. No single treatment can kill all cold viruses. Antibiotics don't work there for bacteria, and antivirals are hard to develop because each cold virus family is so different. Your body does the heavy lifting, mounting a defense every time, which is why you can catch colds dozens or even hundreds of times in your life. Third, adaptation. Cold viruses are built for survival. They spread before symptoms even show, sneak through air and touch, and can live on doorknobs longer than your patience. They are the perfect evolutionary parasites, annoying, persistent, and everywhere. So, the truth, the reason we don't have a cure, isn't for lack of trying. It's because the cold is the greatest trickster in the microbe world. Scientists have thrown everything at it, from silver bullets to chicken soup to, yes, gene editing, and still it shrugs, mutates, and asks for another round. But here's the twist that gets less press. The cold is supposed to be beaten, not cured. Your immune system is built for this. It's a training ground. Every sniffle, every sore throat, every miserable night wrapped in blankets is your body's way of leveling up, learning to fight, making new antibodies for the next round. That's why, by adulthood, most colds are short, mild, and mostly annoying. For children, each cold is a lesson. For adults, a nuisance. For the elderly, sometimes a real threat, which is why care and comfort matter more than ever. This doesn't mean we're powerless. Science has given us better hygiene, faster diagnosis, and a world of symptom relief. We know to wash hands, sneeze into elbows, and stay home when sick. Well, most of us. We've invented humidifiers, saline sprays, menthol rubs, and lozenges that soothe without the side effects of medieval treatments. But we're still enduring, not eradicating. And there's a quiet beauty in that, if you pause and let it settle. Because what unites us more than the shared ritual of suffering? The cold isn't just a medical condition. It's a global, lifelong tradition. From the deserts to the tundra, every human, everywhere, has faced the indignity of a runny nose, the itch of a sore throat, the half-mad hope of a miracle cure. Maybe, in the end, we don't need to conquer the cold. Maybe we just need to outlast it, together. Let that sink in. Billions of humans, across time, all wrestling the same invisible foe, all inventing their own small rituals of care and hope. The cold is the great leveler. Kings and peasants, old and young, sick and soon to be sick, all shuffling through tissues and whispering, will this ever end? And yes, it will eventually. But until then, we've got soup, science, stories, and each other. Maybe that's enough. It's late. Maybe you're bundled up in bed, phone screen aglow, a mug of something warm pressed to your lips. The house is quieter now. The coughing fits have slowed. In the gentle hum of the night, let's gather for one last ritual, the story of what the common cold really means. We've wandered through the history of suffering, from Mesopotamian goat bile to TikTok garlic hacks. We've seen kings groan beneath diamond poultices and grandmothers conquer illness with whiskey, soup, and faith. We've watched scientists admit defeat and influencers claim victory over mucus with nothing but charisma and questionable produce. We've laughed at leeches, rolled our eyes at royal sniffles, and winced at mercury muffins. But at the end of this marathon, after 17,000 words and centuries of remedies, we are left with something quietly profound. The cold, in all its annoying glory, is the most human of all ailments. It finds us when we're run down, when the seasons shift, when life says, slow down, and the world outside forgets to pause. It forces us into bed, under blankets, off stage, and out of the endless loop of productivity. For a moment or a week, we become small, tender, a little helpless, and that, oddly enough, is its gift. Here, in the soft cave of your blanket fort, you're invited to let go, cancel plans, hide from responsibilities, watch clouds drift by, or TV reruns you've seen 1,000 times. Sip tea you never have time to make. Listen to the rain. Be gentle with yourself. For once, you are allowed to be cared for, or at least to care for yourself. Maybe you remember being a child, waking in the night with fever dreams, the glow of a hallway light as someone brought water and cool hands to your forehead. Or maybe, years later, you watched over someone else, a partner, a parent, a friend, tucking them in, making soup, drawing curtains against the glare of the world. In these small acts, love becomes medicine. Every cold is an echo of every cold that came before, across continents, languages, and lifetimes. Humans have always longed for the same things: comfort, relief, understanding. The cold unites us, not because it hurts, but because it reminds us how much we want to feel better, to be seen, to be safe. And so, throughout history, the rituals endure. We light candles, boil broths, whisper spells, or encouragement, fold tissues into little mountains on the nightstand. We scroll for miracle cures and settle, finally, for the warmth of a cup, the softness of a quilt, the sound of another voice in the room. This is the secret the common cold has taught us, that even in weakness, we are strong in our caring, that healing is not a solo act, that the world, for all its chaos, can slow to the gentle rhythm of a single, sniffling breath. Maybe the real miracle cure is the story itself, so breathe in, dust and all. Let the centuries of hope and foolishness, the line of ancestors and the long river of remedies settle softly over you. Let that sink in, because in the end, It's not about conquering the cold. It's about finding comfort, connection, and meaning in the ritual, in the care, in the warm, ridiculous, beautiful ways we hold each other up. Even when we're all a little under the weather. Blanket forts forever. If you made it this far, you're officially cured. Or at least distracted enough to forget you're sick. Hit that subscribe button for more useless knowledge, historical weirdness, and bedtime sarcasm. And next time you catch a cold, try garlic. Or don't. But definitely come back here instead.